Hello, colorful quilters, and welcome to Color Girl Quilts. I am Sharon, and today's video is going to be one of our back to basics. It's all about piecing half square triangles. Now, my focus is on using your scraps because we all probably have a scrap bag that's starting to overflow at some point, and we need to create a project where we can use scraps of all sizes. So I'm going to show you how to make half square triangles with everything from little tiny scraps to larger scraps like offcuts from your bowl, from like yardage to like fat quarters, fat eighths and things like that. Yet where they're all going to be the same size so that we can eventually sew them into a quilt. So a lot of things came together to make me decide to do this for our next video. I just finished quilting, or just finished making this quilt. It's called Rise Above, and the pattern is by Charisma Horton. And when I saw it, I knew that it would make a great quilt for a video class or sew along. And so that's what I've created. So you'll see announced on my blog right now that we are getting ready to launch this first virtual Color Girl class as a sew along. So I've created videos to make each and every step of the quilt. I'm going to walk you through it step by step with visual demonstrations on videos. So I hope that you'll join me for that. I will put the link for all of the details in the description of this video if you want to click through and learn more about that. And I hope that you'll sign up and join me in sewing this. But this quilt kind of got me in the mood for half square triangles, and I love that it is an example of how you can put something as simple as a triangle together in a lot of different ways to create interesting patterns and quilt blocks and an overall beautiful quilt. So I thought maybe half square triangles is a good basic block that beginner quilters as well as more advanced quilters want to learn more about. So that, combined with the fact that I have lots of scraps and I want to turn them into a quilt. Okay, so today is all about half square triangles for your scraps. And as promised, I'm going to show you how to use a variety of scraps. So I have some strips. I've got some kind of odd shaped, scrippy scraps, some triangles left over from another project. And I'm going to show you how to do half square triangles for that. For kind of medium sized scraps, I've got this funny piece with just a chunk cut out of it. And then one that's looks like maybe part of a fat quarter. So we'll use those. And then also we're going to use some of our larger scraps, and I'll show you how to make lots of half square triangle squares using triangle paper. Okay, so in order to make the best use of our scraps, I decided to go kind of small. We are going to make 2-inch finished half square triangles, which means they'll be 2.5 inches unfinished. So once they're sewn together, look like this, they're 2.5 inches. Okay, and so like I said, all of them, from our small scraps, our medium, and our large scraps, we're going to make 2.5-inch triangle squares from all of those using different methods so that you can make the most of your scraps. So let's dive in first with our smallest scraps. I'm going to show you two methods using the small scraps, depending on how small they actually are. Okay, so for example, I have some strips here, and I was lucky enough when I dug through my scrap bin and discovered that these are 3 inches wide. So since our half square triangles are going to finish at 2 inches, we need to start with a 3-inch square, or a 3-inch a triangle with 3-inch sides on the right angle. Okay, the rule of thumb in quilting, whenever you're working with half square triangles, is that you take the finished size that you want. In our case, that's 2 inches, and you add 7/8 of an inch, and that is your unsewn size that you need to cut. So 7/8 it's fine to cut them 2 7/8. I prefer to go ahead and just add an inch instead of the 7/8. It gives you a little more leeway for your seam allowance in case you're not perfectly accurate, and it also allows you to have a little bit to trim when you square up your blocks, getting them all the same size and trimming off the excess seams at the corners. Okay, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. All you need to remember is to choose the finished size that you want and add an inch. So since we're making 2-inch triangle squares when it's all said and done, we are going to start with 3-inch squares or 3-inch triangles. Okay, so lucky me, I have some strips that are 3 inches wide. And what I'm going to do to use these to make 2 triangle squares at the same time, I'm going to match them up right sides facing. And I've got a selvage on that pink fabric, so I'm going to go ahead and cut that off so that the ends of my 2 strips are perfectly straight and lined up. Okay, now I can take my strip and in this case, since I want to kind of just use up my scraps and make several of each variety, I am going to just cut 3-inch squares on my strip. Okay, and I'll keep them mated up. Keep them mated up just like that. As you cut, we'll see how many I can get from each strip. If you prefer to have fewer of each color, then you could just cut 1 and then match it up with another strip if you have that. Okay, now I'm going to take each of these squares and a pen and mark from one diagonal corner to the other. Okay, and once you've done that with each of your squares, take it to your sewing machine and sew 1/4 of an inch on both sides of that line. Okay, so that's our first set. We're going to start first with all of our cutting, and then we'll sew and press and square up. Okay, so I've got a handy little perfect square, but what if I have a piece of fabric that's kind of oddly shaped and I want to make the most of that by cutting some pieces for that? Now in this case, I can take my ruler and see if there's any point on the fabric that gives me 3 inches, and there is for this yellow one. Okay, so I can get 3 inches if I go down here and over here, but it doesn't give me a complete square, so I won't be able to use this method. But I can still get 2 3-inch sides. Okay, so those 2 sides are 3 inches. Now I'm just going to cut them from point to point and get myself a half square triangle. Okay, and then I'll do the same thing with this one. Let's see if I have a 3-inch. Oh yeah, this one's easily 3 inches. So in fact, this one I can get a full square out of, but I'm going to do it the same way as I did the yellow one so I can match that one up. Okay, so just cut a right angle where you have 2 sides that are 3 inches, and then cut the excess from diagonal points. and then mate that up with another one the same. And this one is ready to sew. I'll take this one to my sewing machine and just sew on along that diagonal edge and use a 1/4 inch seam. Okay, so that's going to give me 1 unit, 1 square once it's opened out. This one is going to give me 2 because I'm going to sew on both sides of the line. Okay, now what if we have some slightly larger squares? We can make even more half square triangle squares at the same time. So for this one, I'm going to double my measurement. Instead of 3 inches, I'm going to cut 6-inch squares because I have pieces big enough to do that. Okay, and let's cut a 6-inch from the orange. Now for these 6-inch squares, I'm going to also match them up right sides facing. And again, take my pen. Only this time, I'm going to mark the diagonal corners going both directions. Okay, now when I go to my sewing machine with this square, I'm going to sew 1/4 inch seams on both sides of both lines. Okay, this is going to give me a total of 8 of my little half square triangle squares. Okay, so on both sides of the marked line for your medium-sized scraps. And then I really want to show you how to use these triangle on a roll papers. And there are several different brands available. You can get them at your local quilt shop, online. Most craft stores that carry sewing supplies will have some different varieties, and they come in all different sizes. What you want to pay attention to is to make sure that you're getting the right size, because it lists the finished size of the block, okay, not the cut size or the sewn size. So just like our other ones, these are going to finish 2 inches. For these, you do need a slightly larger piece of fabric. And this is a great method if you need to make a lot of half square triangles using the same fabric. This is not going to be a method you use if you want a lot of scrappy squares, okay? So if you want a lot of half square triangle units that are all different and scrappy, then this is not the method you're going to use. You're going to go for the single squares marked once or the single triangles. But this is a great method to use up larger scraps if you don't mind having a lot that are the same color. And it's also a super quick way to make a whole bunch of the same if you need them for a border or for something like a feathered star block and you want a bunch. So as you can see, while I was talking, I put my fabrics right sides facing and lined the paper up with pretty close to the edge of the fabric. I don't like to get too skimpy and worry about not having the paper completely on the fabric. So I like to leave about 1/8 of an inch all the way around. And then you can unroll the paper down to as many as you want, or to cover your scrap of fabric. So I'm going to go to right here, And you'll just want to keep it as smooth as you can. And put some pins in. Now the solid lines on the paper are what you're eventually going to cut. So it doesn't matter if you put your pins around the solid lines. You won't have to worry about sewing over them or removing them. So I like to do all of my pinning around the solid lines and leave the dashed lines alone so that I don't have to worry about moving my pins as I sew. Once you've gotten it all pinned pretty well and that's secure, get some paper scissors or use your rotary cutter to cut off the end at the place where you want to stop sewing. And then we will go to the sewing machine and I'll show you what to do next. The paper is marked with arrows that tell you which direction to sew each line. So if I start at one end of my paper and follow those arrows and continue, I can sew all of the lines, all of the seams for this entire block of fabric, making all of these units without moving my thread, without having to cut my thread or move my needle. It is a brilliant system and a great way to make a lot of triangles all at once. I'm just doing kind of a short strip, but if you need to do a lot, you can do longer ones and get a whole bunch done at once. So let's start sewing. We're going to do this one first since it's the most complex. Let's place it under our presser foot. Since these have lines marked on the paper, you don't need a 1/4 inch foot or anything else special. You'll just place your fabric under your presser foot and position it so that when your needle goes down, it hits that dotted line. Okay, and it's probably a good idea to set needle down if you have it on your sewing machine. And then just sew along that dotted line, going the direction that the arrows tell you. You can lift up and pivot, or just sew off the end and then turn. And then start at the next line. And continue. And again, you shouldn't have to stop and cut your thread at all. You can just continue sewing right along that dotted line until you get back to where you started. Okay, I've gotten back to where I started. Now I can take the pins out of my paper, and those will be ready for our next cutting and pressing step. But first, let's do these others that I have ready to go. Now for these, the ones with the marked lines, you will need a 1/4 inch foot or to position your needle if that's necessary for your machine so that you get a 1/4 inch seam. So I have adjusted mine so I have a 1/4 inch seam, and I'll sew on one side of the line and then my larger one I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch on both sides of the line for this one as well. And then finally my last one with that I used my smallest scraps, that's just going to give me a single triangle. And this one I'll just sew one seam on the angled edge. Okay, that didn't seem like very much sewing to make a lot of half square triangles, right? And you can especially see how if you use the paper ones, you can make a whole bunch of these in a really short period of time. So our next step, we do have to do a little more cutting on some of them because like I told you before, the solid lines on your papers are for cutting, and then also your marked lines on your square ones are for cutting. So let's go ahead and get these trimmed, and then we'll be ready to press them and square them up and have finished half square triangle squares. Okay, so like I said before, for our smallest little guy, that's just a single square. So we can just press that one and it'll be finished. For our other small one that we started with a single square, we will just cut that one on the marked line. Just a single cut is going to give us 2 of the same half square triangle squares. And then our medium size one that we marked twice on the diagonal going both directions. Now this one we're going to do something a little bit different. First of all, we're going to cut not on the lines, but cut it like a 4 patch. So we will measure halfway in, which is 3 inches, and cut, and then turn it and measure 3 inches again. Make sure you have those lined up nice and straight if you're going to do both of them at the same time. Okay, now take these and cut them on the line, and you end up with 8 half square triangle squares just like that. I love this method because you don't need a huge piece of fabric, so it's just it's good for scraps, but in a hurry you can make a bunch of your units. So that gives us 8 right there, just out of those 2 6-inch squares. And finally, for the one that we did on the paper, this one we want to very carefully cut on all of the solid lines. And if you have enough and you're continuing on with this to keep using your scraps, you can always take these leftover pieces, if you have any, and use one of our other methods for smaller pieces, either 3-inch squares or triangles, and continue to use those pieces until they are all gone, right? So you can just keep getting smaller and smaller. But for these, we'll go ahead and cut squares and then cut triangles. Okay, and of course you will want to carefully tear the paper off, and that will give you your half square triangle square. Okay, remember when you're tearing the paper off, I recommend starting on one of the sides that's not sewn and tear it toward the seam, because then you can rip it off both sides and you run less chance of tearing your stitches. If you try and start by like tearing it off here at the end where you've sewn, you're much more likely to tear your stitches. So start taking your papers out from the middle of the seam out toward the edges. All right, let's finish cutting all of these apart and head to the ironing board and press. Okay, when you go to press your triangles, you of course have this angled edge which is on bias, and you really want to avoid stretching that and distorting your pieces. So I typically press these squares to one side, press the seam to one side, and always kind of get the iron on down first, warm that up, and then separate, and then use the point of your iron toward the center of your seam and separate that out flat. That'll help you to avoid, hopefully, pulling on any of the bias edges and causing them to be distorted. Okay, once you have your squares pressed, we want to make sure that they are all exactly the same size. Remember at the beginning when I said the rule of thumb for figuring the size that you need to cut is to take your finished square or your finished block and add 7/8 of an inch. But I personally like to add a full inch, and that gives me a little bit of wiggle room for trimming and squaring and making sure they're all the same size. Okay, so when I go to start trimming, I'm going to place my ruler so that the top corner is right on the line where the orange and blue mix, right on that seam line. And then since my unfinished square is 2.5 inches, I'll find the point on my ruler that represents the 2.5 inches, which is this little dot, and I'm going to line that up with the seam line in the opposite corner, and then adjust my ruler until I have both this corner and that 2.5 inch dot right on my seam line. Okay, then I can cut those first two sides. See how that gives you a nice neat corner without any extra fabric? And then again, turn it around, place that 2.5 inch dot at the corner where I just cut, and automatically my corner should be up here on the other seam. And I'll cut that second side. Okay, so you will repeat these steps for all of your pieces. The ones that you sewed with the paper should already be pretty close to exactly 2.5 inches. You see this one? It's pretty close. Basically all I need to trim, oops, shifted it. All I need to trim are these little corners, because those papers with the markings allow me to sew accurately. Okay, so now I can take these and see how they look. And of course, there's so many different ways that you can put them together. You can make pinwheel kinds of shapes. You could just make them all going the same direction. Okay, so, and of course that the design that you get out of them is going to depend on your arrangement of colors. I'm doing mine a lot of random colors just mixed together, and all of the triangles are color. But imagine how cute it would be if you, say, did half of them, one half of the triangle squares with your scrappy fabrics, whether that's prints or solid colors, and then the other half is all the same color, such as white or black or gray, or, you know, a little polka dotted print, something like that. Or you could do like a dark and light. One half of your squares could all be dark, facing the same direction, and then the other half going the same direction could all be light, but still using a whole bunch of different scraps. I think it would be so fun to see just an absolute kitchen sink worth of colors and fabrics just all sewn together, but just dividing them between light and dark to create a pattern. So what did you think? Are you a pro at half square triangles now? I'd be curious to know if you have a favorite of the methods that I showed you, or one that you think you'll use the most frequently. Definitely get out your scraps and use some of them up. Make a cute little half square triangle quilt. They're fantastic just placed next to each other. You can twist, you know, rotate and turn them and put them together just right next to each other. You could alternate them with solid squares of fabric. The possibilities are endless. And of course, these are definitely a building block for a lot of classic quilting patterns. So It's great to have half square triangles in your piecing toolbox for all of your quilting projects. Okay, thank you very much for sewing along with me today. I hope that you had fun learning these techniques and that you will sew some along with me. Don't forget to hit subscribe and like this video, leave comments, help spread the word about Color Girl Quilts. And of course, I always appreciate your support in helping me continue to make videos like this one. So next time you need fabric or a pattern for a quilt that you want to make sure you check out colorgirlquilts.com. Thank you very much and happy sewing!